My name's Iorpenda and I'm a Senior Advisor on HIV at the International HIV/AIDS Alliance. So the International HIV/AIDS Alliance is an organisation that works with communities around the world to take action on HIV and AIDS. And we work with schools and communities and churches and networks of people living with HIV and groups such as LGBT groups to ensure that people have the right to HIV treatment and care, health and access to all the other benefits and rights in their life. So LGBTQ stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and questioning group people. Sometimes it also includes intersex, which is an I, so sometimes you hear LGBTI groups, but it's basically representing groups of people who identify as non-heterosexual. But quite often people don't want to be part of that group. They feel that there are very different issues for lesbian women and for gay and bisexual people, and that as a group they don't necessarily want to be part of that. So LGBTQ is a term we use to talk about issues that relate to those different groups of people. Some of them are common issues and some of them are not. Well, in our work, which is looking at HIV and AIDS around the world, I think it's really important because BTQ people have often been found to be excluded from services. They face a lot of fear and stigma and homophobia around the world, and that means that often they're not included in HIV services, they're not coming forward, and the services that are delivered around HIV and health services are just not sensitive to their needs. And so it's really important that we understand the types of barriers that they face in coming forward to a clinic or attending a testing centre, so that we can make sure that they are included in those services. And also these issues affect not just individuals but their families and their friends as well, and so it's important to understand their daily life and their experiences to be able to offer better support. Well, I think worldwide LGBTQ people face a lot of stigma. It's from often the types of things that may be experienced in school, bullying, being ridiculed or laughed at or verbally abused, but it can also be very extreme. And in some countries we've seen LGBTQ groups who have been really experienced a lot of violence and stigma and persecution and even arrest and sometimes even murder. Recently we've had a case of 13 transgender women in Guatemala who were murdered, and last year 93 transgender people in the Latin American region were murdered between just January and June of 2010. In countries like Kenya, where if you're suspected to be a man who's having sex with other men, you can face up to 14 years imprisonment. And we've recently seen the murder of a very prominent human rights defender, David Kato, in Uganda, who was outed as gay in a national newspaper and was murdered in his own home. So we see on a daily basis in many countries LGBTQ groups face incredible amounts of stigma and homophobia, and that's something we need to address. I think it's a really difficult question to answer because we don't really have a sense of what the numbers are of LGBTQ people worldwide. It's very difficult to collect those kinds of statistics. Obviously, with the type of fear and stigma that surrounds LGBTQ, there is a difficulty for people to come forward and actually state that they are gay or lesbian or bisexual. So it's very difficult for us to measure that. In countries like the UK, the census doesn't ask for that information. So globally, we don't really have a good sense. And therefore, in terms of people living with HIV who are from LGBTQ groups, it's again almost impossible to say. But we do have studies that show us that amongst men who have sex with men, often not defining themselves as gay men, that they are, in places like Senegal, 10 times more likely to be HIV positive, and the same in many other countries. So it's a very difficult thing to measure, but we do know that they are at greater risk of HIV. and much like groups of injecting drug users and sex workers, they are a group that are particularly at risk of HIV infection. So it's really important for us to understand more and get a better sense of how many people are living with HIV amongst these groups. I think, as we've said before, the type of stigma that people are facing means that the experience is different. Living with HIV is a difficult thing in itself and is also surrounded by stigma, and many communities are very afraid of being near people living with HIV. But over the years there's been a lot of progress in dealing with HIV, particularly amongst communities. And HIV was actually, in many Western countries, was the first cases of HIV infection were amongst the gay community. So in some countries there's a very established response to HIV amongst the LGBT community, and there is good systems and support, which is really helpful. But in many countries, being gay and HIV positive is a double stigma, and it's very difficult to get support. Many health services, many schools, many clinics will even refuse to accept people from the LGBT groups in their services. And recently David Kato, before he was murdered, spoke in London about his group in Uganda called SMUG Uganda, Sexual Minorities Uganda, and he talked about a group of gay men who are HIV positive living in Kampala in Uganda who are not able to get support for their HIV treatment care, and so they support each other. They cook for each other, they bath each other, they feed each other, and they treat each other's ailments and provide support to each other. But they do that with no support, no money, no materials, no soap, no gloves, and they're caring for each other, and that's because the communities do not feel that they are a part of the programs and are too afraid to work with them or to touch them. And so the homophobia and fear has led to the extreme isolation of those groups. So I think for people living with HIV in many countries who are from the LGBTQ community, it's a very difficult life. I think we do know that LGBT groups are more vulnerable to crime, to violence and to abuse, and we've seen that with the examples from around the world. But in countries like the UK, it's illegal to discriminate based on sexuality, and there are supports for organisations that can support people to report abuse or to talk about issues, helplines and websites. I think for communities in countries where homosexuality is still illegal, it's very, very difficult, and those are the kinds of communities where we're trying to work, and I think it's extremely difficult, but it's about finding sources of support and for organisations to recognise and understand the experiences of LGBTQ groups within their societies. I think on LGBTQ issues, the key message has to be that everybody has the right to live for freedom from stigma and discrimination. And while there's been a lot of progress made by groups all around the world who are fighting for the rights of LGBTQ people, there's still a lot to be done, and that's from your basic day-to-day experiences of challenging attitudes amongst your friends, amongst your school pupils, amongst your family and your community. There's also other work that can be done in addressing some of the more larger campaigns to change legislation. We see that a lot of countries have laws that actually make homosexuality illegal and can lead to imprisonment and even calling in Uganda for the death penalty. But we've also seen really positive moves, such as in India, where the laws against homosexuality have been abolished. So, you know, people power makes a difference, and in joining those campaigns and speaking out on behalf of people who, you know, in some communities are not able to speak out is a really important thing.